Good morning, everyone. Glad that you're here today. I'm Sam Estes. I'm the City Advance Director for City Advance, and I specifically deal with task forces. Our aim is to provide the highest caliber training for hands-on practitioners of city gospel moments. We're helping cities grow in their city movements to the next level, and we hope to impart some of the best practices so that we can be the most fruitful. We do this equip call the first Friday of each month, and so we encourage you. We'll be sending out in January, right before January, we'll be sending out the next 6 months of city equip calls and who the presenters will be. If you didn't get to hear the last one on November 4th, Joel McGill from All America was our presenter. He did a phenomenal job. If you didn't get to see it, I really encourage you to go take a look at that. Then I would also encourage you to go to our cityadvance.net, which is our website, and we're now on the mend, trying to get that up to date so that we'll have more resources for you. Today, it's my pleasure to introduce our presenter, Doug Gamble. Doug's been married for 40 years to Kathy. They have 2 children, Ben and Sarah, 4 grandkids, and 1 due in March. Doug's been in ministry for 42 years. The last 30 years, he's been at Crossroads Fellowship in Raleigh, North Carolina. He began as a small groups and local missions pastor. In 2001, he became the mission pastor, bringing local and global under one department. He served on many community boards for the last 25 years, helping leaders start things like Congregations for Social Justice. He currently serves on the County Advisory Group and on the Raleigh Police I Care team of clergy. He has served 4 senior pastors here and 3 others prior, and he belongs to multiple clergy groups in his city. Since 2010, Crossroads began funding 50+ local agencies as former building payments became a local foundation. Doug has been the point person for that council, vetting all new grant applicants and being the key liaison between church and agency. For the last 13 years, they've gathered all those partners once a year with all the staff, elders, and local leaders, and a few fellow pastors at the annual meet and greet that 250 leaders come to, and it's the largest kind in that city. In January 2003, he'll be at a new role at Crossroads. So he'll no longer be the missions pastor, but he'll be the city pastor, focusing on local partners, our members' marketplace discipleship and evangelism, and a part of the City Advance City Gospel Movement team. And he'll do that for 2 days a week. So it's a privilege to be able to introduce Doug. The best thing I like about Doug, he's my friend. And so I give you Doug Gamble. Take it away, Doug.
Okay. Thanks, everybody. I'm honored to have the privilege to share a little bit of maybe an area that God has placed me in kind of sovereignly, and that is agency and church relations. There's a lot in the city gospel movement, but most of us know, no matter what hill you're coming to, trying to get these 2 groups to dance together sustainably is fraught with all kinds of challenges. And so I want to talk about a lot of what I'm going to share. It comes out of my 30 years here, but some of the time in up near Mishawaka, Indiana, South Bend, as well as Indianapolis. But I can speak mostly about the city here because I was more into a role that allowed me to be out in the community. And our church has done a lot of good things. There's a lot of churches doing that. But in the whole, we're pretty much unicorns and a long way from having the kingdom of God and all of its components work the way we want. So that's kind of why I share the good and the bad, but the untapped potential, which I do think is something our city gospel movements can speak to in any community. So let me walk you through some things that'll be kind of quick, just to review. This is fairly typical in most cities. How do agencies get started? And I think that most of them are founded by a man or a woman, sometimes many years ago. Some of our great organizations now go back 60, 70, 80 years. Some are just handing off their second generation of leaders. The Durham Rescue Mission is a powerful mission on our sister city, and the same couple that founded it 60 years ago are still going in kind of an emeritus role. And pantries, the Second Harvest ministry often spawns and helps local pantries really scale up and become a part of that Second Harvest network of food distribution. Pregnancy centers began back in the 70s. Recovery centers for alcohol, often a county gets into that, but often there's some very good nonprofit or the medical communities help spin off groups for that. Sometimes they're founded by one or more churches. We got a good example. One of our strong urban ministries became the downtown church's basically organization to deal with benevolence. Many of them are trapped on corners, have very limited space. They have drive-in constituencies, and so it's very hard to serve where a lot of the poverty was downtown, even though that's pushing out due to gentrification. But in any case, churches would coalesce in certain areas. They've also done that in the North Hills area, and then they create a ministry that can be a better all service all day long kind of program, and then the church send volunteers and money and serve on the board of it. We got 2 or 3 of those regional kind of examples. Sometimes they're imported. The Salvation Army tries to go where it can, but it needs a local, board to help it get established. Communities and schools, national, state, and local. FCA is like that. There's others, event-driven things like Convoy of Hope. The Dream Center, our own worship pastor started one about 5-6 years ago, and that was from the LA Dream Center. They have 100 of those across the U.S. right now. There's, of course, a lot of prayer ministries. I don't have all of them listed, but you see a few of them there. And then there are regional wide. Some have a national brand. Some are more tied to certain branches of theological parts of the kingdom. Some are regional, Rust Belt, Sun Belt, rural, urban. Some are very strongly faith-centered, and some are not. And that's okay as well. They're people of goodwill. They just didn't have a strong faith. There may be many faith people in it, but it's not driven with the same kind of faith initiative that some are. Sometimes in our city, because we've been a growing city, not like most cities in America, but entrepreneurs will see a need and fill it, especially with the high growth of marketplace ministries. You see a lot of entrepreneurial businessmen seeing a need and deciding to move into it with some fellow business people, which is a great blessing when the business community does that. When cities are growing, communities' needs grow as well. So Raleigh's a fast growing city, but guess what? All of our poverty indicators are growing right along with the high growth of population and jobs and so forth. Homelessness, hunger, and so forth. When cities decline, income and opportunities decline, and needs can go high. So that creates a real challenge in stable or declining communities. And while Raleigh and Charlotte have grown enormously, it's been at the expense of the other 98 counties that are pretty much were killed by NAFTA, economically speaking, and are still struggling with some of the issues that it was there. So some of our own ministries, we push out to some outlying areas through our thrift store because they don't have the resource base that the big cities do. God nudges entrepreneurial people to jump in and address. That's how a lot of them get started. Then there's interesting combos. Sometimes a church gets heavily committed to a certain type of ministry and they own it in a deep and powerful way. Other times it's the mission that decides to do church, along with, some rescue missions actually offer a church service and try to do church to their community as well as the other part. CCDA, that's the Christian Community Development Association, John Perkins was a part of. They've spawned a lot of interesting hybrids in places where both a church and a ministry was needed, and it was just easier to make it a combo when they did that. There's also some postures that are fairly common. I think many of you will recognize these. The one that's still too common is the siloed, not engaged. We don't know, we don't care, we just do our thing. That's one of the things we're trying to speak into graciously and pull people out of that. Then there are those that are married. The church is an anchor and a champion of an agency maybe. I think a good example of this is Tony Evans in Dallas, We've had a lot of involvement with his National Association of Adopt a School Network. And Tony began a lot of ministries. If you've been to his place at Oak Hill Bible Church, he has a whole city block, a pregnancy center here and a thrift store there, jobs program and so forth. But when they're National Adopt a School, and they began to realize every year new kids come into the school. And so that was their way to continually tap into families, particularly of need. And they began to orbit all their other ministries around what you would call their feeder and driver. Schools constantly drawing families, those families have needs. And so that really revolutionized their local outreach. And if anyone's looking for a good example of integrated agencies in church, I recommend going to see Tony Evans. They've got a great model for people to draft off of. Some of the cases, I'm not going to reveal any names, but in my city, I say this with some chagrin and disappointment. Some of our wealthier churches often give dollars and people, and they basically say, hey, we don't want the poor around us. Take this issue and go away. I'm not proud of that. I'm glad they give people in money. I'm a little sad that they really are still trying to stay insular and isolated and kind of buy the problem off without a real heart to embrace it. That's not very biblical, as you know, but that's not uncommon in my city, and I bet in your city as well. There's sort of some ways people get engaged with agencies. Sometimes it's historically. A church was heavily involved in its founding. Our founding elders were part of forming one of the pregnancy centers here back when we started, and we've just always been deeply involved over the years. Sometimes there can be a lost connection, an engagement. That's sort of common. Sometimes it can be renewed, and sometimes it's just a normal outgrowing of two agencies, organizations going in different directions. An agency can often outgrow a church in size and influence. A church can launch something that actually becomes bigger than them. And sometimes the agency can lose its way and a church gets frustrated and decides to move to a newer model. I've seen that a lot in our city. I bet you have too. And then circumstantially engaged. Sometimes a zip code makes it inevitable. Your church is ground zero for a tragedy, a crisis, a big problem like homelessness. You're close to a school. We live close to an immigrant housing area. A lot of homeless camps. Our zip code, our church is very multiracial, and I'd like to take credit for it, but actually it's the zip code. We're the most multiracial zip code in the city. So our church should look that way. I'm glad we did Promise Keepers and have a heart for that. That was certainly beneficial. Not every church around here reflects our community, but sometimes you benefit by what God's doing outside your church if you're open to what he's doing. And then some church agencies are strategically engaged. That's the ideal, unfortunately, the least common. Churches need for this to work, you have to have dedicated staffing. One of the reasons we have such a robust agency partnership with about 50 people we support, another dozen or more that we engage in, like the school system, the county, the police department, so forth. It's because I have a team of 4, and half my team is regularly working with the city. Without that, we would never have our people serving on boards, volunteering, pushing out, celebrating, doing all the videos we do. It takes a lot of effort on my team to help our church keep that engagement. A church strategy for outreach includes partnering, particularly the cost. I think to be strategically engaged, you have to own the cost of partnering, having clear outcomes, knowing how to celebrate, keeping the relationship. One of the reasons we do our annual meet and greet, honestly, is out of those 250 leaders that gather here every year, there's probably 25 or 30 that change. They get promoted, they retire, they move on, they switch to a different agency. I have pastors come and go. So just to keep the relationships lubricated and current, that's one goal of that event, is just relationship trust building. That's the main thing we do, is we sprinkle in partnership principles. It's good if you follow some kind of key principles like Phil Butler's book, Well Connected, exploring, establishing, and then operating a truly well-defined and owned partnership. Both organizations have to make adaptations as things grow and change, which they will. And then a church really has to take responsibility, I think, to stay up with constant changing of personnel, even as it just happens to change. If you don't keep the relationships well connected, partnering can unravel pretty quickly. Here's some good things in church agencies. When they have realistic expectations and sincere relationship engagement, if there's an appreciation for each other's culture and DNA, and then they've spent the time, the exploration to find the sweet spot where they overlap and realize we could do a lot more and a lot better if we put our things together. And then there has to be a sustained commitment through the hard times. Like we just went through some hard political times. We've had the pandemic. It's encouraging to see agencies and churches who have sustained that because they were well formed. But I have to tell you, you've probably seen they're just like businesses going out. A lot of good things have unfortunately fallen apart. They didn't have probably quite the sustained commitment they needed to go through a hard time. The other thing is fruit trees bear their sweetest fruit after the 5th year. And, most businesses or startups, even in the nonprofit world, even in churches, very few make it past year 5. And sadly, many partnerships, they'll collapse before that payday because there's an impatience for outcomes sometimes, or at a certain level of outcomes, not appreciating that coalitions and partnerships are like a tree. It has to form and mature and get its own strength up to a certain level before it can bear a certain amount of fruit. And I think that's not well understood. And it's part of the reason business leaders, church leaders, others can get impatient. They think all we're doing is talking about partnering, but often good, important foundations like building a house or community are getting done so we can have a sustained, long horizon payback. And I think that is unfortunately at the root of a lot of start and stop and not really get off the ground and have a sustained history. When both share a citywide ministry, that is so sweet. It's sad that, and I think this is where city gospel movements can bring a very missing element to good intended things in most cities. There's few people with a citywide paradigm. And I think we can help bring that, not to take them off of their focus, but to help them see how their thread fits into the tapestry. Also, being data driven, I've learned a lot of that from the county. I thank goodness for Glue and Barna, because they've been trying to coax the church into being more data driven within itself, but also in our communities. The government does a great job of keeping track of what's really happening in our city down to the zip code neighborhood. And sadly, most pastors have no clue, except for church planners who will at least look at some of it when they plant a church. But there's a lot of good information that's not, unfortunately, tapped into in how we do our efforts. So they're often well-intended and they miss the target. And they think, well, I guess we didn't need a food pantry after all, because they were 3 zip codes away from the food desert. And then focused on measured outcomes. This has been hard for churches and agencies to adapt to over the last 20 years, but I think we're way better at owning that we got to prove what we're doing. And now a big popular thing in my agency world I'm seeing is their ministry model, or their, I'm missing the exact word here, I didn't write it in here, but their philosophy of change, where they can actually connect the dots from the outcomes all the way back, and then show the monetizing and the volunteer need, so they can actually say another $50,000 can help us reach X number more families with the desired outcome. And that's really important for business leaders and government people who often do look at a bigger angle than maybe church leaders do. If they both share that ministry, you have to build in celebration times. Amazingly enough, some of our best ministries often don't take a victory lap. And I think that's unwise. Tony Evans taught us about that when he came and did his training here a couple of years in a row. It's important to celebrate the good outcomes, and the city's looking for that. And often we miss a chance to broaden a coalition because we don't take a victory lap on a certain breakthrough. Here's some more good things. When best practice is known and followed by both organizations in a dynamic way, none of us get the best practice and stay there. It's an effort to get there. It's an effort to stay there. Ministry Ventures really did a lot to revolutionize my own department about 18 years ago. Mission Increase, I was just at that comes out of, is called Mission Triangle now, but the Mission Increase is a foundation network across the states. Most of you know it started on the West Coast. They are doing a killer job. Our local group, now called Mission Triangle, the people in Charlotte are now wanting to do a branch of that. They are just transforming the best practice act. I can tell it from our partners. I look at their communication. I look at their board engagement with me when I go to their events. I've seen over the last 12 years what Mission Increase has done to up the game, and just to see way better outcomes, way better partnering. So I think for communities that don't have that, one of the things that gospel movements can do is try to figure out how to bring some of those really good training assets to bear, because most of them are online. Our group is now reaching people around the country because they don't have it, but that's a good thing. Thank God for technology. So the cities that have these resources need to know how to push it out. And I think networks like ours can help places that don't have it, find cities that do, and learn how to tap into it. You need a clear ministry model. This is their basic governance. You got to have a good board practice, proven model of engagement, good communication to all stakeholders, a wise fundraiser and stakeholder development doesn't happen by accident, and then a really healthy volunteer culture. I'm telling you, I know who has good volunteering because my people go and stay, or they bounce off and start complaining to me. So that's often a hard conversation to go back to partner and say, I've had now the 10th member tell me how they bounced off of your effort. We got to fix that. I can't keep promoting you if we don't improve that outcome. Now let's talk about some of the bad. I'm not trying to pick on anybody. I've tried to not mention anybody by name here. This is just character stuff, things I've seen, and that is personality versus organizationally driven churches or agencies, even partnerships. It's great that they can often pull it together. They sparkle for a while, but when you've been around for a long time, you begin to notice they often melt down or blow up, especially when the leader gets fixed on something and the board finally realizes that's not good, and you end up with a blow up or a meltdown. I'm way too familiar with that in my city, and it's such a bad witness for the whole kingdom. And I can say from our founding pastor blew up morally, and it took us a decade to get over the shadow of that. And so I'm pretty sensitive to it and try to personally intervene anytime I can to try to help things smooth out, because we do need strong personalities, but they need to be healthy ones. And we all know in the kingdom, we have a lot of narcissism in leadership that's been, had some fabulous blowups, which we don't need to talk about here. It happens in every city. Ignoring history and other kingdom actors in the same area. I think this is the root of most of the dysfunction in the nonprofit church world. We just don't even care what God's been doing outside of us, and don't take the time to learn. And I think in the movement right now in our city of reconciliation, a lot of that is many white churches just don't know what they don't know. And when they start studying it, we've got a group in our church that just regularly is doing that. It's amazing how that changes the conversation when people just learn what they don't know. But you got to commit to it. It takes time, effort, energy, and you have to be willing to give up blind spots and so forth to do that. And a couple of city gospel leader movements that I've met, one of the things I've been impressed with is people who start this, who take the time to discover, how did this city get founded? Where are our generational sins? What has been, like we've had prayer meetings over the places where slaves were sold right here in our city, where a lot of terrible injustices happen. And so some of that breaking the strongholds in prayer, one of my dear colleagues spent his first 10 years here as a church planter. That was sort of their calling. Their church went around to high points as they studied and just confessed and invited others of us to do it. That's a hard thing to do. But I really think now, looking back, anytime we have prayer breakthroughs in the heavenlies, it shows up down on the street. But often no one takes the time to do that. And I really salute our prayer ministries who not only are praying about needs, but understand the multi-dimensional level of prayer and getting cities to go back and stand in the gap. The prophets weren't guilty of the sins they repented in sackcloth and ashes for. And that's a beautiful thing. We don't have to have been personally guilty to own it and apologize, ask God to deliver us and break it. And something happens, and when that begins to be done on a regular, consistent basis. And of course, competition instead of collaboration, it poisons a lot of things and causes people to become jaded, and they're hard to pull back into a healthy collaboration. That's a bad thing. Losing the transformational element of the gospel. I think, I don't know if I need to say anymore. Many nonprofits begin with faith, but they lose it. Often the city and the corporate money, they get told, if not publicly, privately, tap down. We don't need to keep talking about Jesus so much. And before you know it, they're doing great social work, but the gospel's totally absent from it. And so they meet a need, but they don't really transform a life. And maybe a good social service organization that no longer has the gospel in its client's journey. And our foundation did a huge pruning last year. And one of the things we did was we decided who is faith friendly and who is faith driven. And we pruned in order to create some cap room to do capacity grants. And mainly we're getting back to those who are truly not ashamed, like Paul, to have the gospel as part of their client's journey, not force, not obnoxious Christianity, but just make, one of my partners, she's a member of my church and leads an organization. And one of their biggest things, they offer to pray for people. every time they come to the food bank. And that has just developed the whole rest of their ministry, because people mostly are glad to be prayed for, and it just opens up doors. And so it's sad when agencies lose that in their history. Sometimes there's a lack of sound theological thinking for church engagement with other churches, even agencies, government. Partnering isn't merging and losing identity. It's actually quite the contrary. Good partnering will tell you got to know who you are if you're going to enter into a coalition or partnership. And outcome-based partnering can be a huge help. I've used that term and kind of invented it, I guess, here to get my elders to get past their theological blinders and say, just what would Jesus do? And do we really care if people who disagree with us are willing to help tutor kids, fill up a food bank, help after a hurricane? And it took a while, but we have slowly got into our leader. But believe me, I have to constantly cultivate with new pastors and new elders what outcome-based partnering looks like. We're not compromising our theological stands, but when we're serving needs that Jesus did, we don't need a theological agreement with everybody who shows up to help or contribute or partner. But that takes some mental gymnastics, and I think it's one of the things that hurts a lot of churches who they stay in a theological filter only and don't see the wisdom of collaborating beyond their tradition or even beyond faith community entirely. And one of the ways I try to help bring pastors around that is to just show them what Jesus did. And I think there's a way but we need to help people in the gospel movement to know, how can I be pure to what Jesus called, but also do this other stuff? There's a false barrier there, but it's real, mostly in their mind, but also in their policies. And so helping them not feel compromised to engage in a way they never have, that's the untapped potential that we have to figure out how to tap into. Sometimes there's just a lack of common paradigm and nomenclature. Every sector understandably has their own. You all know that. It's unconscious to them. So when they start to partner, especially initially without any training, they often unwittingly just project their paradigm and nomenclature. And I've sit in meetings and just listen to people talk past each other. I'm sure all of you have too. We're all susceptible to that, and it takes effort to get beyond it. And I think every sector has to work about that. And partnerships of any size need to figure out, how can we talk a language that we're all good. Even having a glossary, we've done that in one of our county groups, so we all kind of know this is what we mean when we say that. That's hard partnership work, but it leads to a better harmonious kind of way of communicating, so we don't talk past each other. Here's one I see both in the nonprofit and the church world: jumping in without counting the cost for a sustained effort. We have good intentions. We really are trying to do a good thing, but we don't do any homework. We don't do any research. We start without really knowing to build the house, without knowing how much material it's going to take. And as soon as it gets really tough and hard, and those early enthusiasm goes away and a couple key donors drop, it's just easier to look for the exit ramp, and rather than double down and really think of a long horizon commitment. And I'm sad to see that, because I think it's good intentions that didn't get to fruit because they weren't well trained. And again, I think I'm trying to speak as Gospel City people. This is an area where I think we can help. If we can catch people early and give them some help and slow down, count the costs. Let's think long term when we do these engagements. And then just failing to need to appreciate trust. We all say often partnership moves at the speed of trust, but no one ever spends time just building trust. It's one thing to do it one-on-one, but even collaborators at some point need to be in a room with focus on trust and relation building. Sam knows that from the groups that he pulls together. You have to do that, and he's got a great strategy for that we need to help other cities find. And failing to continue to nurture that relationship as people come in and out of ongoing partnerships. Let's look at some of the untapped potential. Now, I'm going to show you my county because that's what I know. This is unique, I realize, for every county. I'm just using this as an example. I'm going to go through this pretty fast to make a point. The Research Triangle is a 6-county area, metropolitan. That's what we call the triangle, at least the government does. That's about 2 million people. We have 1,136 nonprofits in my county, which doesn't include the spillovers, probably closer to 2,000 when you add the other 5 counties. We're the largest county. 300 or 400 begin every year, and 300 fail every year. So that it's not, and some of those are faith-based failures. So there's a lot of good intentions ending up in a bad place because they haven't been well directed. The number of churches is my estimated guess. We're between 1,800 and 2,000. I was on a group that spent about 2 years figuring that out. No one has the responsibility of counting churches in our county. And you think it'd be easy. They're not all in the yellow pages. They're not all easy to find. We start with the denominations. There's so many independents. And after 2 years, we met once a month. We finally found the 1,700 or so churches in our community. That was 25 years ago. Between the closings and the addings, I guess we're 2,000, maybe a little north. We have almost 8,000 businesses. 700 of those are internationally owned. Like we have 60,000 Muslims here. A lot of those ministries are owned by people from the Middle East. Families at twice the federal poverty line are 60,000. That represents a little over 150,000 people at high risk with no margin. And most of the church and government agencies are focused on those 150,000 people. This is just a quick, you all could find this for your own area. This shows you the breakdown. I'm wanting you to see we're a blessed community. We have wealth of education, wealth of finances, jobs. We're a particularly rich community. I guess that's why a lot of people are moving here. So I want to be sensitive to the fact ministry in my city is different than most cities. When I was in South Bend, we were the other way around. You could drive 3 blocks through empty buildings that were no longer there because they'd been shipped overseas. So I've worked in the Rust Belt for 30 years and now about 30 years here in the Sun Belt. And so the Sun Belt, the Mid-Atlantic has been a growing area for 30 years, benefiting from a lot of the growth that's come from the North. So I think it's important for us not to take credit for things that are bigger than us. And I'm blessed to be working in a resource-rich community. And one of the things that I'm grateful for is that a lot of what's spilling out of our area is pushing out to other communities in the state of North Carolina. But you could find these kind of things to see how your employment works, your point. And the point I wanted to make was that we have the resources, but we're not using them well. Every sector has made multiple attempts for some kind of partnering, but mostly failed. But that says that the desire was there, but not the modality of how to do it. They lacked adequate experience with multi-sector sustained unity. I've been invited to many of those: marketplace, government, nonprofit, churches. Believe me, I've probably been to 36 of those in 30 years. Unfortunately, some went for a while, but they never lasted, I think, for the lack of city gospel movement architecture and language paradigm. Some have had better outcomes, and I give our city county government high marks because they're stuck dealing with, schools, government, and police. They have to deal with the dysfunction of our culture. It's their job. And they have at least keep trying. And I give them a high marks for how they've reached out to the faith community, our police department, the eye care team I'm on, and others. Projects and event have come and done some really good things, like CCDA. We've held their national conference. We've had Caravan of Hope. But very often those don't bear very much fruit unless they arise out of an existing or an emerging coalition. So I don't think they alone, it's good to have them, but they're really fuel on a process that's already there. If they come and go, the impact was a weekend and it's gone. And that's unfortunately not the best thing. Each sector has its own internal battles. I lived in Indianapolis when the former mayors brought about Unigov, which kind of got rid of some of the craziness that you can see between police forces and county, city government and so forth. Many cities still need to find a way to do that. It becomes an underneath. It doesn't end up in the news, but when you go to coalition meetings, you see a big sheriff won't talk to the police because the sheriff department's county and the police department's city, and we got 15 municipality police departments. You wouldn't think that'd be a problem. It is a problem. And it's the same way with churches. You can't get Catholics to talk to Protestants or Jews talking to Muslims. I mean, we all have this sort of sector disunity, and that's a factor. It's a reality. Many cities need to find ways to help those various groups find some way of collaborating themselves so they can then be a part of a larger collaborative net. In education, we have public, charter, private schools, church schools, private schools that aren't church schools, and then homeschooling. Many of them are well connected within, but not across the platform. And some families spread their kids into different parts of that. And so when you try to minister to children and youth, it's not so transparent as it used to be. I have a sports mission outreach we helped launch, and we're spending as much time in the after school, outside of the school system sports, which are frankly now eclipsing the size of sports in the schools, if you've not noticed that. So we can't just go to the sports teams at school and think we're getting all the kids in sports. A lot of them are outside the school system doing sports that maybe the school doesn't do, or they're doing it all year long in hopes of getting up to the next level and so forth. Churches don't have a wide area Kingdom of God network. I hate that that's the reality. I think it takes a sustained effort by a lot of key leaders who are keepers and stay a long time in a community for that to happen. And in my city, we've been growing too fast, and the turnover of leadership is that's a big gap in our city that I wish we could figure out how to fix within the church kingdom. The United Methodist Church is an example. They're melting down. They're now the disunited Methodist Church across the country. Businesses often get impatient with government, nonprofit, and faith community, and I understand why. So the still untapped potential. Our county is blessed with many resources. We don't lack assets in faith and nonprofit and business and government. We have some rock star examples actually in every sector, but it hasn't built a lasting movement yet, surprisingly. So we're like a team with all stars, but we can't win our conference from a kingdom perspective. What we lack is the essentials of a deep collaboration and partnering that covers the unmet zones and allocates our resources more wisely, equitably, and sustainably. And what we need to release this potential is when churches begin to see potential for community impact beyond themselves, when agencies and governments can appreciate the cradle to grave calling of churches is different than focused issues, and how we have to work together to give people a lifelong pathway, not just a one interventionist kind of pathway. Network leaders discover they're part of a network of networks. And I'd say here, not every person in a network needs to see the whole, but the key leaders of clergy networks need to see all the other clergy networks, and those men and women ought to be talking together. So when an effort to get something through to the church, you got 12, 15 people that can get it down to 200 or 300 or 400 churches. That's Rob Kelly's doing a great job of that in Charlotte and others like him. That's a big need in our community. How do you get the word out to the faith communities, particularly in a time of crisis? You can't build the networks. If they're not built, it's too late. So that's a key need for getting network leaders to also understand and meet other network leaders. And then the other thing is when there's enough trusted relationship brokers who coalesce into that sustained city gospel movement, if you please, that leverage their influence downstream, but also keep an eye for the whole and are willing to leverage their influence to quickly or slowly bring their network in line with the larger thing God needs to do or wants to do in our community. Here's some things I've seen after 30 years here. We have many of the pieces of a movement. Thank God he's working among us despite ourselves. We got great prayer efforts, small coalitions, marketplace, engaged government at many levels, healthy nonprofit sector, all the pieces, but they need to multiply. And for example, we have a note in a pocket group. In our building, we lease space to them. They went from serving 3,000 families to 8,000 by the extra space they have now. But the need is 60,000 families. So we're not even touching 1/6 of the families that need what they're providing. That's just true in almost, you take any sector you want, mental health, all the others, foster care, just go down the list, tutoring our kids who got behind during pandemic. I mean, every one of these ministries or causes needs to scale up to the need, and we're not there yet. And all these pieces need to be mapped and nurtured. One of the things that is kind of new to a lot of folks, even in the agency world, no one maps like the government, but we really need kingdom people to map kingdom work and use that data as helpful influence. And we need more transformative leaders in each sector that lead their sector while transcending it and having a gospel network framework, but also how to influence down at the grassroots. I think we have assets to address our needs. We just lack the unity and the will to do so. And it pains me to say that because that's not true of everybody. It's just true of so many of the bodies that we need to be engaged. That's the unfinished task for us as a community. We have compelling needs that are pushing us. So it's not like many people are unaware of the needs. They're unaware of how to address them in maybe the most effective way. And I think, again, that gives me some hope as a city gospel movement that I don't have to go and convince people of the needs, but I do have to help them find the on-ramp that they can sustainably engage. And we need to respect history, geography, the drivers of both assets and the drivers of need. I believe we need a gospel city movement paradigm to connect the pieces that are here and to help them grow to impact the still large unmet need zones. And I'll end at that point so we can do some Q&A. Sorry if I went too long there, Sam.
You didn't go too long at all. That was awesome material. Thank you very much. We're going to open it up. If you would like to ask a question, or you have a comment, or you need clarification about what he was talking about, I would encourage you to unmute, ask the question. If there's any space at all, I have about 4 or 5 questions. So, but I want to open it up to you. So go right ahead.
That was awesome, Doug. I wrote pages of information down there trying to keep up with your PowerPoints. But one of the areas you covered, they were all very relevant for us in Ottawa, Canada. But this question about partnering and helping people understand it isn't merging and losing your identity, because often that's our challenge. We're trying to get people to think centered set, but they're still kind of fearful of people they think maybe theologically unsound or different from them. So that was really helpful. And I don't know if you use that centered set language sometimes to help people understand when they or how they can partner with others.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of work. I hope to spend time actually writing, particularly my fellow pastors, since I know so many of them have objectives and also ones who've broken through. I really want to create positive, healthy pathways for pastors to deconstruct and reconstruct a healthy mindset and then take it to their elders or deacons, because it's both and. The pastor can't go farther than his leadership allows. But often I'll say to this group, I think a lot of churches don't want to engage the hard part of outreach. And so a theological blinder is an easy excuse to not engage. Now, I wouldn't say that in public, but I'll say it in their office with tears in my eyes. And so we have to call people out where we have trust to do it, but we also need some positive ways they can process. I didn't get here overnight. I've had, 20 dozen people bang on me for years in that first decade, getting me to where I am. So I want to be one of those healthy, positive things of helping people who may have in their heart, they know better, but they're comfortable having an excuse to not have to engage.
Rick, one of the things that you mentioned that has just hit me, I'm going to say maybe about 3-4 weeks ago, was this concept of celebrating what has occurred so that you allow people to become part of the ministry, part of whatever it is that you're doing, versus, boy, that was sure great, wasn't it? But you don't tell anybody.
I just went to one yesterday, and it wasn't everybody. We've started Love Life. It started in Charlotte. We have it here 40 weeks a year. We go to the largest abortion provider and pray in front of them. Other volunteers are there every day, sidewalk evangelists, and just some of the numbers. We were at an ice cream shop. So we had ice cream and gathered around, and some of us pastors prayed for them. And it was just about 40 people, 4,000 prayer walkers of 52 churches. They had 400 at the last meeting. They had 9 salvations, mostly boyfriends and fathers, saved 92 lives just this year. And I could go on. The rate of people coming to that has dropped 30% since we've been out there praying. So we're praying this year it'll drop another 10, 12%. So, that was important. I was moved to tears, honestly. And meet pastors. I probably got 5 contacts from pastors. I go to my week and they go to theirs. And so there is a need, even if it's not everybody who's involved. Those little celebrations are important. God did a lot of good things in that ice cream shop yesterday, just to celebrate in this downtime and encouraging her, praying over her. That was spontaneous. That pastors just came together and did that. So,
but I think getting that word out to others that might not be part of your organization is just as important.
I wrote down 3 ideas just talking to her. Like, we got a big crew. So in September, I'm going to try and get my college team to go out there, not on our day in August, but when all the college students are there. And I wrote down 4 or 5 ideas. Even a local friend of mine who runs a 3 or 4 assisted living, he has deep pockets and, he cares about this cause. I just need to go and say, hey, Kendall, could you put put a few $100s a month into this, or a couple thousand a year? Be small for him, but be huge for her. And it came because I'm eating ice cream and celebrating what God's done together. And so it's just the little things that spring out that are important for developing momentum. it comes out of celebrating in a way that I didn't appreciate early in my ministry. And I'm so sorry. We missed a lot of good celebration times, but we try not to do that now.
Alan.
Yes, I direct Love Incorporated in Fresno, California. And our main goal is to screen needs, find out what they are, and then to mobilize churches to meet those needs. Through the years, we found that churches were able, like you said, give money, give stuff, kind of like knock on the door. Oh, did Loving send you? Here's the food, slam. And have you found it? We are about to embark on a new approach to churches, asking them to develop trauma teams. When we send someone to them, this team will come and actually love them, pray with them, share the gospel with them, invite them to church, tell them about the church programs, just get to know them like they would anyone else who shows up on a Sunday morning, basically to love them and be available. So have you been able to organize anything that helps churches to actually love the people we send them to rather than hand them a bag of food?
That's a great question. And I would say one of the reasons I'm shifting my role is to do better at that. I mean, we give $350,000 a year and probably 800 volunteers. That's a pretty good day. But everyone here is excited about it. But I tell my senior pastor and elders, guys, there is so much fruit. We're not squeezing the lemon at all. So my new role change is to spend time. For example, one of my sports ministries, they led 47 kids to Christ last year, baptized a dozen of them in the church that they use. And I said, Mark Miller, how can I invite those other parents and kids? What 12 or 15 can I baptize? What about some of our churches in our United network of youth pastors? So the church, there's room to take, he's got the fruit, converted kids, and he's a disciple maker using basketball as an excuse, but we're not getting the fruit back into the church. Now that's one of incorporating them after salvation, but the same way with trauma, one of my members who works at North Raleigh Ministries, they're doing exactly that through prayer and realizing, where can the church come and add to what we're doing? We're doing food, they're doing basic budgeting, some of the simple stuff. And so I think there's a lot of, I'm using the theme this year with my group called Bridges. We are not well bridged to each other. Many good intentions. A lot of stuff happens accidentally or because a director and a pastor are highly related and they make it happen. And with all of my partners, I haven't had enough time to make those things happen. And I'm really looking to do that because one of my members works with a transformational network here in town, and she's just developed a concept just this week we're unrolling called building a community anchor. And she's worked a lot on the city, the county, government, and so forth. Used to be a DOT engineer, but has a heart for Christ in the Christian world. Led our first re-entry council that the state mandated. And so she's now she went to a little African-American church that already has a private school. They're in a strategic desert. And she was able to convince that pastor, who I know from our archive team, we work on the police department team. She was able to get the county and 4 other agencies to come along and say, listen, he's willing and able, they have the facility, but don't have the staff, they don't have the money, they don't have the transportation. And so there's a coalition building around they're starting with what they need. They probably will end up doing more. And so she's developed a whole way of how do we take what churches do have and link it to those who are. So one of the things they're doing is training lay people to do entry-level trauma, not what a trauma specialist would do. People aren't all in need of counseling and meds because they have trauma. But I mean, when I do a funeral, I got traumatized people. I'm used to dealing with trauma, but the average person doesn't get that. So a key part is training a church to realize you can do more than you think, and you're not alone. When you need a referral, that's part of your training. Hey, I've got 3 people to call because this person really needs more than I can give them. And so there is a great need. There's an expertise in the nonprofit world that the churches don't appreciate. I was at an annual meeting with Mission Triangle this week, and one of their presenters was a pastor, and I saw one of his associates at the ice cream social yesterday, and I was telling him I was so glad to see they're going through the best practice training as a church. As a result of that, they've gone from giving out a few $1,000s locally. Last year, they gave out over 100,000. So here's a Christian nonprofit teaching a church how to be a better run church. And they did not drop their budget. That came out of the other pocket of their people. And so you're training for trauma, training for fundraising, training for communication, celebrating. There is so many assets. It grieves me to see how many people don't know, but you just have to win one at a time, get one project and multiply it. And so I think you're right that the church could benefit so much by not being afraid to partner. And just one of the things I expect to do is take pastors on tours, strategic half-day tours, to see government in action, to see a Christian nonprofit, to see a coalition, and say, and here's the assets I see as your friend. You've got these assets and these opportunities. How can we grow your church and your mission by making you a more indispensable part of this zip code? And they just need coaches and friends to help them do. I don't think there's as much resistance to doing it as we sometimes imagine. Oftentimes, I don't know how. And so it's easier to stay here because I'm afraid I don't have much leverage to go out there and lose. So I'm going to hold my gunpowder until I feel like I have a surefire win. And helping people get small wins to build on is a good thing I think Gospel City Movement leaders can do. Small is okay. Start small and build on it. And that's what this strategy is. Start with one thing and then add others as you build but the structure is really well thought out for how to do that.
Doug asked, what specific tools do you use to do your community assessments and measurements?
That is a great question. Our county actually, some of you may or may not know, I think it began maybe before Obama or certainly during Obama. There was a huge emphasis for a lot of HUD grant money that filters down to states and communities to require every 3 years you do a community needs assessment. It's pretty robust. It takes about 10 minutes to answer. It's online. Just to give you one of my frustrations, I pushed that through my network, but my own senior pastor and elders, and don't tell them I said this is recorded, they may hear it, but that's okay. We could push that to our whole membership, but we wouldn't. There was no appreciation for why our members should share their perspective on what they see, so the county would know, because the county uses that data to figure out what's the hot spots, where to allocate new money or old money. And so the church has got an audience of people well connected to need, but we don't get that data that the county is asking for. And it's easy. So I think our government does the best job of it, and then they make it available. So we have a big foundation town, the John Rex Foundation. Rex Hospital is a huge hospital. They have a foundation. They have great community mapping. I was just studying it yesterday. It tells me exactly where the populations of kids are, how the affordable housing varies across our county. It's a mind opener when you become data driven. And the government does better data management. The church is totally oblivious to that being out there.
You talked about a cradle to grave pathway. What does that mean?
One of the things I began doing 2 years ago, right before we decided to prune down to the faith-driven people I mentioned, listen, we didn't prune a bad person one. They're still my friends. I love them. I appreciate what they're doing. But I think the Lord convicted me, when Paul says, I'm not ashamed of the gospel. One of the things I've done in my partnering, my biannual meeting with leaders, and certainly with new people, I'll give you an example. Richard would know a lady named Kim. She runs the interfaith, the coalition for all the homeless people. So we have a wonderful nonprofit managing everybody that deals with homelessness, everybody. And they advocate for them and they bring them together. Richard's been a part of that for years. Well, when Kim came to my office, I just took 5 minutes and said, listen, I just want to kind of set this issue. I have a great respect for you, but I want you to know what I believe. And it was a testimony, not a sermon, but I said, we want to partner in an appropriate way, but my goal is to bring people to Jesus Christ, to make this life better and to prepare them for the next life. I'm not ashamed that that's what my organization does. And we start with the cradle to the grave. Now, I can't leave that at home when I come to your coalition. Are you okay with that? I'm not wanting to hijack your meetings. I'm not wanting to push stuff into your thing that's inappropriate. But I want you to know the assets my people can bring besides money and volunteer hours. We have this long horizon view of people, and I think you actually would want us to do that. But sometimes you all squeeze that out of the agenda, and this is why a lot of my faith partners don't want to be a part of it. And I have found, and then I offer to pray for them. before we leave. And I have yet to have a single, even non-Christian person refuse me to pray for them, which I always do. And many of them are lapsed Christians. And I do a little convict. I say, well, I know you're a pastor. How long has it been since you've been to church? As I'm going to call him and tell him you're AWOL, you need to get back there. So even an opportunity of partnering becomes an opportunity to build trust and to speak faith in a positive way, in an encouraging way. And I have started doing that, and it's having a cumulative impact on the DNA of our partnering culture. And I think it's something the Lord had to prompt me to do because it is easy to ignore. And as I've opened it up, I'm now doing pastoral ministry to many good Christian leaders who are in a big church and their pastor doesn't even know what they do. And they're doing as much ministry every day and they have no pastor. And so I'm getting to pastor people just because I'm a partner and I donate people and money to them. And I intentionally engage them to love on them. So I do think that is a key in building these relationships, is meeting people as fellow people, not being afraid of what we do. We're not everything. We're not the social. I can do Celebrate Recovery, but I can't get people who are drunk tonight in a safe place with a nurse to dry them out. That's not my lane. I can do tutoring, but community school is way better. I'd just rather send my people and let them be trained and well managed than me trying to do it on my own. And so knowing our lane, but not being ashamed of our lane, and knowing many of those clients need the social capital that churches have. I recommend a book here. It's not even a Christian book, called Bowling Alone. Go look that up and Google it. And he talks about bowling leagues that went away and the decrease of church membership partnership has actually caused a lot of poor people to decline in the amount of social capital, which is what's creating many of the chronic people at the poverty line. They're not fine. I'll give you an example. My folks were poor as dirt when they left Harlan County. They went to Cook County, got involved in a church that was well networked with a dozen other churches, got us through college. My son's now, Fortune 500, unicorn in a great company. How did that happen? I can tell you how it happened. Good public schools in Cook County and a good, healthy church that went out to the poor and to the mission. And we were very engaged. I look back now and realize how sovereign it was that little church of 100 people in Hammond, Indiana, were engaged in doing ministry because that pastor was a community-minded pastor. And I grew up thinking everybody did that. And so it's important for the church to reclaim. I spoke last month at my pastor's group, and I talked about the Catholic parish idea. The Catholics get it. We're here to lift forth Christ. It's why we build a tall temple, and we're here, our cathedral. And I think City Gospel Movement can encourage churches to reclaim a biblical apostolic role that often they have just forgotten. And it can be quite empowering and encouraging. And I just encourage it. I want to write some more about that in the coming years.
What I wanted to know is we're a really small city here in California, 12,000 people, but I've never done a community assessment and a needs assessment. Can you tell me briefly how to do that, or a place to go to get it?
I have a friend, my friend Francis. I think I'll connect you to Francis. Can you send me your if you got my email, could you send me your email and phone number?
Yeah.
And Francis she came out of DOT where they do tons of mapping. And then when she retired from that, her husband's works in big pharma. So she's kind of taken that skill set and applied it to the nonprofit world, has a website, and she does these kind of assessments from the simple first conversation with a potential all the way to let's do a deep dive. And then some of that is aggregating known things. Like, for instance, the government keeps track of a lot of things, but opinions and questions about pastors, they probably don't. So then it's like, hey, here's 3 questions. If we email this to 40 pastors and half of them responded, that could be pretty reliable picture or perspective. And so there are some assessments, like the thing the government does is pretty thorough on a lot of different areas, and you go from 1 to 5 on it, and then you get a printout, and then they share the result for the county. Like my own regional CAC, the Community Advisory Council, we take the county data, we have a fifth of the county, and sometimes it's different or trending like the county. And I would bet she could help you tap into some good government info you have that the good thing about it is it's true and baseline. It's measured because they take a comprehensive approach. Probably what you won't know, even in a small community, is what the faith communities do. And that may be, she could help you devise a simple, figuring out the data you want first, who has it, and then what's the most expeditious and likely way that they'll get it. So maybe 3 emails of 3 questions over the course of a year gets you more data than giving someone a big thing, or some phone calls with people you know, and just taking notes to get the data you want. Especially the faith community is horrible about having any unified. It's not. I'm not blaming them. I've been frustrated as a faith leader in the county that we have Catholics and Protestants and Jews and Independents and Methodists and Presbyterians, and none of them take responsibility for anybody else. And some of them don't even do a good job. Our local Baptist group, God bless them, we're kind of part of their tribe. They don't even keep track of all their stuff. There's so many independents. And so independence is good, except that no one tracks the data and accumulates it. One other thing I would suggest to you, even for a small community, have you heard of GLUE, the spinoff organization of Barna?
Glue, you said?
No, I'll help him with that. So just so you know, John is the neutral convener for the Kingsburg Task Force. And so John and I have been working together for a little over a year. And so I'll help connect him to those things.
The 2 things I would say: GLUE has a special community leaders like you. It's not real expensive, but it takes some money. And what they'll do is help you take Barna tested questions and send it out to the agencies, and then aggregate it and give you the report. So they're kind of like, instead of doing a survey monkey, they actually do better because they really carefully do the questions, and they can probably also compare it to a nationwide or even California. Say, okay, in your surrounding 4 counties, here's where your community is. And they've been building that for about 4 years, since before the pandemic. And if you get connected to them, you guys would benefit a lot from that. Probably be well worth the money.
It's been neat what's happening here, because we've got most of the churches beginning to come together and say, how do we become the one church of Kingsburg? I mean, that's pretty awesome to me. And that's what was one of the lead pastor, one of the bigger churches here, said, how do we become one church here?
Praise the Lord.
We've got a good
exciting
association meeting that only just started up again about a year ago. So that's happening. So we're getting connected with the churches here, which is neat. Our task force has been wonderful, because we've gotten, yesterday's meeting, we had the city manager was there, two members of the city council were there, plus several pastors, a bunch of people from the schools. It just feels like God's bringing together all the key players from the city. And it's like, I just looked around there and I was like, it began to bring tears to my eyes, because it was just like, there's a family.
Doug, I am so grateful for what you gave to us today. Your many years of working in the community, and the transition that you are now making from being in the total church world, which you've always done, but now you get to do it full time. And I'm so excited about what God's going to continue to do through you. Let me pray for you and for us as we close out. Our Father and our God, as we come before you this morning, we are so grateful for how you've called us to serve you. Thank you for what we have gained today in terms of knowledge and insight about how we could, in terms of best practice, do better at doing city gospel movements. Thank you for Doug. Continue to work in his life. Bless him, give him favor as he continues to reach out to the world that you've called him to. We love you and we honor you now. In Jesus' name, amen. Amen. Hey, again, thanks for coming to City Advance Equip. We'll be back together again in January, on the first Friday in January. And we'll have for you then a whole list of things that we'll be doing. Again, thank you. May God richly bless you, and have a great Christmas. See ya.